All right, it's time to move on now in our weather units to El Nino and La Nina. You're going to hear a lot of things in this portion of the unit that are going to seem very confusing. You're going to hear a lot of terms come up in the videos, in the articles that you read. Just really pay close attention to the notes that I have in here, the review game at the end that you'll have on this new Nearpod slides that I created for you. And focus on those things more than some of the other things. You don't need to know the ocean temperature. You don't need to know the times of the year per se. You don't have to memorize the rotation of the years and how scientists predict it. Those things are all important, but you don't have to know all of those things to be successful with El Nino and La Nina. There are some simple facts that we're going to state and put out there in the notes, and those are probably the most important things. And we'll put those out there for you so that you won't have any confusion when you get to the quote-unquote test at the end of the next 3 days. So let's move forward here with El Nino and La Nina. First and foremost is, let's start with El Nino. El Nino is this kind of odd weather pattern where the water in the Pacific Ocean starts to get warmer than usual. And the odd thing about that is you would think, oh, wow, okay, the ocean gets warmer in the Pacific. How in the world, because the Pacific Ocean's like over here, how does that affect me in North Carolina way over here? It would blow your mind how large of a scale an El Nino event is. It's global. It changes things around the entire world. There are places that are going to have a lot of rain and flooding and storms, and there are going to be places that are going to be going through things like drought where there is no rain. And we'll cover that. They do occur every few years. You'll see this portion about they're not predictable, but there's some science now that's starting to get a little bit better to kind of understand when we're going to have El Nino and La Nina seasons, but they are still, for the most part, unpredictable. And it's important. One important thing to remember is this right here. The water near the Pacific Ocean or in the Pacific Ocean gets warmer or hotter than usual. Okay, that's something you want to jot down. I'm pretty sure that ends up in some of the questions on the quizzes and things like that. You need to know that El Nino is a warming of the Pacific Ocean. El Nino is a warming of the Pacific Ocean. Now let's think about that for a second. If we've got water over here that's getting a lot warmer than usual, you need to think back all the way to, you could even think of states of matter, or you could go to the water cycle. What happens to water as it starts to get warmer and warmer? Well, if it gets warm enough, it's going to evaporate. And if you have this giant body of water that's gaining all of this heat, and there's a lot of evaporation from the ocean, that leads to a lot of condensation. And if there's a lot of condensation, that can, in some places, as you can see here, lead to a lot of precipitation. Now, it's odd if you look here. Down here, I've got an area where there is a lot of rain, and then if the further north you go, still on the west coast, you see that it's dry. So you don't want to be like, oh, El Nino makes it rain and it's warm everywhere. That's not the case. It does get warmer in a lot of places, but it doesn't necessarily mean rain for everywhere. So be very careful as you're taking notes on that. But it is important to understand, like, warmer water means more humid air. More humid air means the odds of having more condensation. If you have more condensation, then obviously you can have more precipitation, because the more and more water from the ocean that evaporates, it's going to come back down at some point in the water cycle. In an El Nino year, the warmest water moves east across the Pacific. So it's moving in this direction. It's coming from the west and it's moving toward the east and getting a little closer to the west coast. Thunderstorms that are caused because of this can change these two jet streams, the subtropical jet stream and the polar jet stream, and it can move those around. And obviously, you know, because we just studied jet streams, that if you change jet streams, well, you really are changing a lot about weather, because jet streams have a huge impact on how weather moves. You're seeing that the cooler air is being pushed up further north. There's some warmer air being sucked in. And this subtropical jet stream that normally doesn't even make it up into the United States is now kind of getting pulled up a little bit. And so that's a little bit different. We usually don't see that making it up into the United States. We usually are dealing with this polar jet stream. It changes the weather in the United States. It definitely changes the weather in California because the water here is what's getting warmer. And it also changes the weather for us in the southern states. And you'll notice here, we're in North Carolina, so here we are. We're going to typically have a little bit more rain. So we're going to have warmer temperatures in North Carolina, and we're going to have a little bit warmer winter, and we're going to have a rise in precipitation. So this is huge down here, North Carolina. Increase in winter temperatures, so it's a little bit milder winter, not as cold, and it's going to have an increase in precipitation. Depending on where you are in this and how much, how drastic the El Nino is, you can have floods and a lot of damage caused by floods in areas. And so that's something to think about. But the thing that's probably most important here is in North Carolina and other parts of the United States, it does cause an increase in temperature, which means then the winter it wouldn't be as cold, and you could have a lot more rain. I would be interested. I mean, we just had a very, very mild winter with hardly any rain. So I'm actually going to stop and go see if we're in an El Nino right now. All right, so I just literally went and Googled, are we in an El Nino in 2020 or even in 2019? And since July of last year, which is about pretty much when we started school, the Pacific Sea temperatures have remained INSO neutral, which means neither El Nino or La Nina. And so it did get close to El Nino temperatures in October and November. And if you think about this year, if it's getting close to that, maybe that's one of the reasons why we had such high amounts of rain as the year went on. So we'll pause this portion and jump back into the slides now. So again, remembering, as we just went and checked that, again, remembering that El Nino does have a significant effect across the entire globe. All weather, but a lot of weather really depends on ocean temperatures. Where the ocean is warm, obviously, like we've already said, more clouds can form and more rain will form due to that. The sun is what heats up the surface of the water, but in an El Nino, that portion of the water that's not normally as warm becomes warmer than normal. And again, like I've said before, it's odd to look at some portions of the western United States are warm and dry, while others are, again, getting lots of rain. El Nino is kind of odd, but you got to think about this. In an El Nino, South America, which is a little further down here, is dealing with massive flooding during El Nino year. They're probably watching out for El Nino very closely. They don't want an El Nino weather occurrence to happen because it causes floods there, because they're even closer and they're getting hit with this subtropical jet stream, which is bringing in that warm, moist air that we talked about, because over here we would have that maritime, tropical air, and it would bring in nothing but moist air. And then if you throw in even more moist air from an El Nino, well, they're going to get tons of rain, and too much rain leads to flooding. Okay, this will be for you when you're watching this, so I'll skip past this. This is, I'll explain this really quickly. It's probably one of my favorite comedians of all time on Saturday Night Live doing an El Nino bit. I think you're going to love it. We'll skip past this and skip past this. And that brings us to La Nina, where El Nino raised the temperature of the Pacific Ocean. It caused the jet stream to move around. It had wetter weather, even milder winters. It had drought in some portions, the upper western portion of the United States, and it had like floods in South America. In North Carolina, again, it just raised our air temperature. It meant that we had more precipitation, but also a little milder winter involved. La Nina is, well, it's pretty much the opposite of El Nino. Instead of the Pacific Ocean getting hotter, it cools off drastically. In a La Nina year, the winds above the Pacific Ocean are really, really strong, stronger than normal. And again, that happens because there's a massive difference in air pressures, right? So these winds are so strong that they push this warm ocean water, well, it'd be this way. From over here, it's going this way. Right, from here, it's pushing it this way. And it means cold water starts to come up to the top in this area of the Pacific Ocean. So we've had a cooling of the Pacific Ocean. Now that's going to cause some drastic differences in weather. And it's a global event, just like El Nino. Again, we have that warm water moving this way. That means like over here and well, maybe down here, but Indonesia and Australia are going to get a lot more rain than usual. Back with the El Nino, Indonesia and Australia were going through droughts. Now it's the opposite. Now the United States up here is going to be like it normally is in Seattle, rainy all the time. And then if you look down here where it was raining all the time, it's now starting to get drier because La Nina kind of does the opposite. You have to understand that La Nina is going to cause a rise, and you read that here, La Nina can do more hurricanes, and it specifically leads to more hurricanes in the Atlantic Ocean. Well, we live about here. This is the Atlantic Ocean, so if we are on the Atlantic coast and there's more hurricanes during a La Nina, people in North Carolina would need to worry about a La Nina season. That means the chances of hurricanes are higher. Again, because that warm water is being pushed this way, which again, how that affects us here is kind of wild, right? But let's look at some other changes that La Nina can bring to us. During a La Nina, the jet stream can dip pretty low. Now, you already know this. If the jet stream dips low, now listen, I know you're thinking, Mr. Bullens, it's up high over here. No, over here. It's going to dip even lower than this, okay? It's going to dip low. You know that's bringing in colder weather to North Carolina if the jet stream dips low enough. For the most part in a La Nina, it's cooler and drier. So remember how El Nino, everything was rainy and warm? La Nina, cooler and drier. Again, the most dangerous part of La Nina is in the Atlantic Ocean. It's a more active hurricane season. We live on the Atlantic coast. And because of that, people in North Carolina would really be worried. If you lived on the coast, or if you had a house there, or maybe you even rent something there, or you know someone in the house there, you would be a little more worried during a La Nina. Now, again, we're able to track hurricanes, so we're able to kind of get out there and get ahead of those things. But just knowing that there could be more could definitely cause a little bit of stress for people. I'm going to skip that. Again, El Nino and La Nina. What's the difference? Well, they both happen in the Pacific Ocean. You can see here the water in the Pacific Ocean is getting warmer. You can see here that the water in the Pacific Ocean is getting drastically cooler, and it has global things that change around the whole world. But if you look at North Carolina in specific, in an El Nino year, a little warmer, a lot more rain. In a La Nina year, a little cooler, a little drier. But then you also have to understand that it could be a more active hurricane season along the coast, and that's something that you would want to be very, very careful about. There are a lot of other things that are going to show up in the articles that I've assigned, in the videos that I've assigned. But for the most part, when you get to the end of this, and I think it's the very next slide, and you should be able to, because they've added time to climb, and you should be able to play by yourself. When you're doing time to climb, if you can answer those questions, then I really think that you will do very well on the quote-unquote test at the very end of all this, because those questions are very similar to what you're going to see on the SchoolNet test at the end of that. If you don't understand some of the questions, go back into your notes, go back into the slides, go back into the articles, the videos, and find where those misunderstandings are and correct those. And again, if you have questions, please leave them on Google Classroom. Just questions. Leave these silly comments. We don't need those. They take up too much space in the feed, and it's hard to find the real questions. But if you have questions, leave the questions, and I will do my best to get to those, and we will move on. So that is El Nino and La Nina.